Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we're going to talk about covens. Something that initiates often tell seekers, but that I think doesn't always come through to seekers in the way that it's intended, is that when you're looking for traditional Wicca, the most important thing is that you find the right group of people. Right? Like, frankly, more important than the specific tradition that you're looking for. What matters is that you find the people that you click with. And part of that is a matter of building interpersonal relationships that are going to last because you're going to be, if you are initiated into a coven, the ideal scenario is for you to belong to that coven for years and years and years. Uh, Part of it is also finding people who have an approach to ritual that works for you. And I think part of why this is a difficult message for initiates to get across to seekers, is that it's very difficult to convey to seekers just how much variation there is in practice between covens. A thing that people, including myself, have said, and I'll say again, is that there can be more variation between two covens of the same tradition and even the same lineage than there is between one of those covens and a coven from an entirely different tradition, right? Um, it is certainly true that there are Alexandrian covens that have more in common with the way that I practice than some other Gardnerian covens do. And so, especially as an outsider, especially as a seeker, when you're looking for initiation into a tradition, you don't really have a way of knowing the specifics, not just of what the tradition looks like, but of what the tradition as practiced by that coven is going to look like. Because there's a lot of variation. There's a lot of variation. Um, and and I mean, there's so much variation that being an initiate in the same tradition does not in any way guarantee that you would be a good fit for a particular coven, right? There are countless other Gardnerian covens and coven leaders whom I respect, who I, welcome as members of the same community that I'm in, but who are just doing such radically different things in ritual, who understand the purpose of Wicca so differently than I do and than how I was trained. Um, and like there are so many times where I'm talking to someone and they talk about, a choice that they've made for their coven, and my knee-jerk reaction is, "What the fuck is wrong with you? Why would you do that?" Now, very importantly, no one's right and no one's wrong here, right? Like, I have a previous video called "What to Do When Other People Do Wicca Wrong" or something like that. Uh, Wicca is decentralized. Wicca is an experiential mystery cult, and part of what that means is that people are going to experience the mysteries differently, right? Other covens can approach Wicca how they want to approach Wicca. They do what works for them. That's legitimate. There is nothing the fuck wrong with them. But there are lots of coven leaders, including people who are friends of mine, people I like really closely respect and admire, where I look at the way that their covens operate and I'm like, oh, I would have left the craft years ago if I had belonged to your coven. And vice versa, right? Like they wouldn't get things out of the way that I do ritual either. It's okay. This is a variegated and decentralized practice. But because of that, when you're a seeker, you don't really know what ritual on the other side of initiation is going to look like. Even if you think you know some things about like the tradition that you're seeking with in general, that doesn't necessarily translate to the specifics of how the rituals are done by the coven that you're seeking with. And so the most important thing is to find a group of people that you like, a group of people that you get along with, that you trust, that you want to do magic with, and who indicate that they have an orientation toward what they're doing in Wicca, however they might indicate that, whether that's with like an outer core ritual model or whether that's just with conversations or whatever, but like who indicate that the way that they're thinking about Wicca and the way that they're approaching Wicca is the sort of thing that you feel like you would be compatible with. And ultimately, you never really know. And also, once you're initiated, the way that you're trained is going to strongly influence how you think about Wicca and what you think Wicca is supposed to look like and so on. That's normal, that's natural. But because you have so little information, not just about the tradition as a whole, but also about the way that a specific coven is going to practice, you really can't use that as a determinant when you're a seeker and you're trying to look for a coven. What you have to look for is, hey, are these people that I like? Are these people that I trust enough to take another step with them? Not the step of initiation, but just like to take another step of getting to know them more. And right, when you start seeking with a coven, it's really very low commitment, but you, at a certain point, you got to get out of your head and you got to just say, like, yes, these are people that I like. Let's see where this goes. And I think it's really hard for seekers to understand the extent to which the coven matters. The coven makes a difference because of the differences in ritual, but also because of the differences in culture. In right, like there are covens that only ever see each other for ritual, and there are covens that do PJ parties together and watch The Wicker Man and all belong to the same Underwear of the Month club. It's a matter of finding a culture that's the right fit for you, and it's finding people that you get along with and that you want to do ritual with. That's going to be the thing that should make your decision. Not because the ritual stuff doesn't matter, but because there's an epistemic barrier. You don't have access, you don't have the ability to know what the ritual stuff is going to look like. So when you're making your decisions, you kind of have to make a decision based on the people. Um, and and this feeds into, I think, a larger conversation about the amount of difference that there is between covens and the way that covens and traditions relate to each other. Several years ago, I attended a talk by a high priestess who's based in London. And she said something that has really stuck with me because I think it explains a lot about Wicca. And she pointed out that right in 1957, Doreen Valiente and Gerald Gardner split. Valiente kind of gives Gerald an ultimatum and says, "You're talking to the press too much. This is supposed to be a secret witch cult. Like this won't fly." And Gerald pulls some hooey out of his ass. And the end result is that Doreen leaves and she kind of takes half the coven with her. And what this priestess said in her talk, which I had never considered before, but it's absolutely true, is that up until that point, there had only ever been one coven. Right? Wicca was constructed around this idea that back before the burning times, there would have been covens aplenty across the land, and we worshipped in all the great temples and yada, yada, yada. But actually, there had only ever been one coven, right? Regardless of when you think that coven started, whether you think it started with Gerald Gardner, whether you think it started maybe 10 years before Gerald Gardner, there was one group, and it was a group of people who came together, were interested in witchcraft, were trying to reconstruct the witchcraft that they thought might have been practiced, in the Middle Ages, in whatever past life where they were witches. But there was only one group. And all of the rituals of Wicca and all of the logistics of Wicca were built up around there being one group. All of the norms that we have in place in Wicca were built around a system where there was only one coven. And so there was no thought to how does this coven fit into the larger tradition, right? How does this coven relate to the Gardnerian tradition? What are the lines between the coven practice and the traditional practice? Because there wasn't a tradition. There was just the coven. There was just the one coven. And you had the high priestess in charge of the coven who was making decisions about how the coven was going to practice. But there was no feedback loop, the way that there is now, between what is my coven doing and what is done kind of in the broader community of the level of the tradition. And so then, right, like when Doreen leaves, all of a sudden people have to start thinking about, oh, how does it work if someone leaves a coven and decides they want to go start their own, right? Because like splitting up a group can cause strife, it can cause all kinds of problems. Like this was a thing that people had to think about. How do we do this in a way that it doesn't blow up in everyone's faces? And, some norms were put into place around how hiving works and who has the authority to hive and how to hive in a way that is peaceful and allows you to maintain healthy relationships with the coven that you originated from. And those norms continue to exist, and by and large they work. But there are a lot of things in Wicca that are still that were put in place in this time when the coven was the only thing that existed. And so much of Wicca is focused on this idea. So much of traditional initiatory Wicca, yada, 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 right? Like, obviously, I'm not talking about solitary eclectic Wicca here. But so much of Wicca is focused on this idea that the basic unit is the coven. Everything is centered on the coven, which is why Wicca is decentralized, for better and for worse, right? It means that covens have a lot of freedom. Each coven can experiment, can do things its own way. You have a lot of covens that are bringing in like local land spirits from the particular place where they are, or maybe you have people in the coven who are really artistic, so they're bringing in like a lot of visual arts into the way that the coven does ritual, or you have people who are really interested in ceremonial magic, so they're incorporating some like angels and demons stuff. Like there's a lot of flexibility, and that's a beautiful, wonderful thing. Now, the decentralization also can create problems. In particular, it creates problems with kind of policing within the community, both policing for bad actors, right? Thinking about like abusive covens ends up being very, very hard to handle the problem of abusive covens because there's no central authority, right? Like if you get someone who is a legitimate Gardnerian, they have the ability to set up a Gardnerian coven, and other people can do their best to kind of scream until they're blue in the face and say like, hey, these people are bad news. What they can't do is delegitimize the Gardnerian practice, right? Like I can say up and down and left and right, these people are really dangerous, these people are violent, whatever the case may be. What I can't say is they're not Gardnerians, because they are. And that ends up being a real serious problem. There's also kind of a related problem of how we draw the lines around who is and is not Gardnerian. The US Gardnerian community in particular, the entire back half of the 20th century was just a lot of bitchy infighting and self-aggrandizing politics over, I think that these people aren't legitimate because they didn't do X, Y, and Z, and they're not downline from so and so, and right, like, and it was all bullshit. It was all just politics. But politics like that happen when you have a religious community that has expanded beyond its basic unit, where you have several independent covens that are all, in some sense, trying to do the same thing, but that are also all very, very different from each other. And this question of, like, how do I recognize that someone is doing the same thing as me, even when it looks very different, is a salient question. I think my default attitude, just kind of as a reaction to the horrific witch wars of the 80s and 90s, and even the 70s, my default reaction is one of it's pretty permissive. It's pretty like, okay, the way that you do ritual is not recognizable as Gardnerian to me, but whatever, you've got the lineage, and like I'm not gonna raise a stink over the fact that your practice looks as different as it does from my practice, because no one needs those kinds of fights over legitimacy. And relatedly, right, like, again, the basic unit is the coven. What someone else is doing in their coven does not actually in any way affect what I'm doing in my coven, and vice versa. And this is one of the norms that was put in place very quickly after Dorian Valiente left Gerald's original coven. Because, yeah, like, kind of a live and let live attitude. If the fundamental unit of Wicca is the coven, which it is because of the origins of Wicca in a situation where there was only one coven, if the fundamental unit of Wicca is the coven, then covens have to be able to operate autonomously from each other. And that's a really important value in Wicca. And that creates some problems as far as like understanding how we draw the boundaries around what is and is not our community. But I think not honoring that creates more problems than it solves. I think we really have to allow covens to be what they are. But coming back again to the starting point of this video, all of that is opaque from the point of view of a seeker. From the point of view of a seeker, you don't know what a coven's approach to ritual is going to be. You don't know which things they have introduced as innovations of their own. You don't know which things they've gotten from their specific upline. You don't know which things they maybe have gotten from their upline and eliminated because they don't like them or whatever. Like, there's so much variation, and it's so hard to explain to anyone who hasn't seen it how much variation there is. And because of that, and because the fundamental unit is the coven, and you really can't draw an easy through line across the tradition, the thing that you have to fall back on as a seeker is, who are the people here? Who are the people here? Do I like them? Am I willing to extend enough trust with them? Not necessarily to jump right into initiation, right? Because you need to get to know people for a long time before considering initiation. But am I willing to extend enough trust with them that I can say, like, yeah, okay, I will be a seeker with you. I will get to know you, and I'll see where this takes us. When I was seeking, I knew that I wanted traditional Wicca. Really, I thought that I wanted Gardnerian Wicca, but in hindsight, I didn't have good principled reasons to be seeking Gardnerian over, like, Alexandrian. It happened to be the case that there weren't any Alexandrians I knew of who were convenient and accessible to me, so the people that I interviewed with were all Gardnerian. But I interviewed with 3 different covens. And the thing that I interviewed with 3 different covens. I also spoke to at least one other coven that ended up being too far away. But the thing that made the decision of, like, who I said, yes, I would like to commit to seeking with you, was my initiating high priestess. The day that we met for an interview, we sat down, and most of the conversation we had was not about Wicca. We talked a little bit about it. We talked about the re-enchantment of the world. We talked about the importance of doing magic as a way of putting your ass on the line, which I may have talked about in another video. If I haven't, I'm sure I will at some point in the future. But most of what we talked about was not Wicca. Most of what we talked about was James Bond. And we sort of bonded over... we had a shared fondness for the James Bond franchise, and, you know, we're messy and stupid and misogynistic and problematic as it is. We were both raised on those movies. And we made a personal human connection, and I was like, oh, this is someone that I like. This is someone whose home I'm willing to show up to. And I want to see what that connection is and how it develops. That was the thing that made the decision about which coven I ended up training with. It was a human connection. And then, you know, as I spent time in outer court, we did ritual together. I liked the way that we did ritual. My high priestess seemed knowledgeable. There was a lot about her that lent credibility and that made me more and more confident that I wanted to pursue initiation with her. But going into it, especially in those initial meetings, I didn't know how this coven would practice versus that coven versus that coven. What I knew was that I met this woman, liked her, trusted her, got along with her, and wanted to see where that went. And because covens are so different from each other, when you're seeking, that's the thing that has to matter the most. So, I will stop rambling here. For those of you in the US, I hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving. I am sure I'll be back sometime soon with more idle thoughts, but until then, stay well. Bye.